So hi everyone, thanks for coming. I believe we're running slightly over time, but I'll assume that we're all okay to stay and don't have any further exciting plans for this evening. But I'm sure Lauren will give me a shout when my time comes to a close. So I'm Ben Moody. I lead the health and local public services work we do at TechUK. We're a trade body. We represent the tech sector. Everyone from Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, down to your kind of one-man band startup. And the majority of our members, unsurprisingly, lie somewhere in the middle of that scale. I'm delighted to host this fireside chat. There's a lack of a fire, but one of the greatest private art collections in London, which is much preferable. And we're talking about building a healthy digital ecosystem and a reflection of two nations. The panel's already been introduced, so I won't do that again. But if I can just give some opening comments. When we look at the NHS, generally, step out of our tech roles slightly, this is not a bad country to get sick in. There's about 200 nations out there, generally speaking, whichever international comparison you look at, there are worse places. However, in the tech world, I think it's generally recognised that when you look at our level of GDP, the level of advancement of technology in other areas of our industry, that we are not really fulfilling our potential. And some of the conversations I've had around this room certainly chime with that analysis, if I can say that quite diplomatically. So I'm joined by a very experienced panel, experienced both on the NHS side, but also in tech in Israel and in Niamh's case here, but also internationally as well. So I think it's good to draw those international comparisons. And then the NHS can be a notoriously difficult place to do business. I know that's not the best advert for our service, but those of you who've had experience will have encountered some of the barriers. So I guess my first question to pose to this panel is, what advice would you give to companies setting up, starting out on that journey, looking to run a tech company here where the end customer is the NHS? And I'll start with Niamh.
Start.
Thank you.
So hello everyone. I think, yes, so I famously hosted a panel with some startups where I asked them that same question: what advice would you give to a startup considering starting in the NHS? And one of them said, don't start with the NHS. So I will refrain from offering that advice. I think the challenge with the NHS is it's not a thing. It's not the NHS. Actually, it is many NHSs. And so the challenge for people coming into the country from other areas is that the complexity can be quite baffling. Where to sell to, who to pitch to, who to talk to, and you can spend an awful lot of time having lots of very nice conversations with people that don't actually lead to anywhere. So I think there's a couple of things you need to do. Is you need to think very carefully about who is your market, who are you actually pitching this to, and try and get to them as quickly as possible. There's actually lots of really helpful, very good navigators. I mean, Sam is a great example of one, of people who can point you in the right direction. So kind of listen to them, take their advice, and make sure you try and minimize the time you burn on people who will have, give you very supportive messages, but ultimately won't help you get your product launched. The other thing I would say is think about selling to the people who sell to the NHS. So again, there is a wonderful set of, quite complex public procurement rules and frameworks and lots of things that are quite expensive to get on if you're a small company. So go find the big companies. We work with a lot of startups, and sometimes that can be a helpful route to market. So look at the ecosystem that's outside of your space. So who are the medical device manufacturers, the pharma companies, the consultancy firms, whatever it is, and see if you can find alternative routes. So that'd be my two tips.
I'm not the secret agent of the NHS. The best guy, I think, to address it is obviously Sam. Sorry, but in terms of our perspective, I would represent for a sec the startups who are looking for integration. Let it be the NHS, let it be Kaiser Permanente, let it be a big provider elsewhere. I would say and pinpoint three things. One, as a startup, you should always understand that the other side, the provider, has been flooded with tremendous amounts of opportunities of piloting. In most stages, in most cases, this will be piloting, validation as the first step, obviously. And if you would have gone to the NHS, I assume, and if you would have gone to Kaiser Permanente, if you would go to the Haklalit Sikfon, the largest HMO in Israel and the second largest worldwide with 4.5 million patients, those would be the same fixedness, if you will, the same stagnation, the same mindset that you need to break through. And one of which, regardless of the technology and to how much would that be disruptive, is their capacity. They've been flooded with 80, 100, 120 proposals of technologies, some of which are solutions, some of which are products, some of which are services, and there's only so much that they truly can handle. There are only a few pilots that could be validated and tested in such and such regions or in such and such departments or in such and such. So the capacity is one thing, and as such, the more you come up with a solution, a wider, a holistic solution, rather than a simple pinpoint product, this will be better off in terms of the value and the value creation that could be resulting from that pilot. Second would be, if you do come across that stage, and this is a must-do, and this is some of the stuff that I've been doing also, regardless with my position to Sanara and my position in the Export Institute, I've been helping also the World Bank, the venture capital team of the World Bank, in doing some piloting in growth markets in India and Brazil. And we were trying to define always the success criteria. Some of those startup companies, they come, I believe, to the NHS as well, and simply would be excited from the fact that they're running a pilot, but they need to dive into the detail, and most importantly, what are the success criteria? In some cases, it will not be the same in the eyes of the startup company. Just implementing that and running a validation of whatever would not be considered as a success in the eyes of the NHS. And if so, would that result in a letter, just even a letter of intent or whatever, stating on behalf of the NHS, we did conduct this pilot. I'm not sure if you guys are or were doing this or not. I'm just saying as a general of the things that I've been doing locally and globally. This is a must-do, to dive into the very pragmatic details of the pilot, the success criteria, who's going to cover the cost, who are the contact people to address this and this and this and this. Let it be a statement of work, let it be a pilot, a validation, better site agreement, or whatever. This is a must-do. And thirdly, I would say that I think that eventually, it may sound redundant, but finding the right people within big corporates, we've been working with Philips and Teva and others, and finding the right people it takes a while till you recognize who is the pinpoint, who is the guy, the person who is not just in charge, but who can really be a champion to push this through. The next 6 to 8 months, the next 8 to 10 months, this is a process. And you have to go through the ups and downs and be frustrated with and whatever, but you have to find the person who's going to be a champion of innovation, who's not afraid of, go get them and represent your position within the big organization. This is a must do. Otherwise, there's so many ways to kill a cat, there's so many ways to kill innovation, and NIH, not invented here, is a symptom, it's a disease in big corporates and others, who is staying away and saying, this will not work, this will not fly because of such and such and such. And you have to find the right people, and not just those who talk too much, but rather those who really will push it through and will go through the ups and downs and will not give up. Thanks.
So I might be a bit controversial. So look, I'm not representing the NHS, but I was recently, until very recently, in the NHS. And I guess my perspective would be that the NHS is definitely not one thing. It's about 23,000 different things. So the first thing to accept is you have to find that right person. And you might have a lot of conversations to get to that person. When you find them, give them what your value proposition is, and also think about what it means for you. What do you really want? Do you simply want a pilot because you're going to export elsewhere, or do you really want to try and scale into the system that is the NHS? But also be prepared to accept some challenge. If I think of one of what's not even a scale-up anymore, it's gone beyond that, someone who's here today, who I gave a really tough time to when they first came to present their idea. And I probably pretty much was pretty brutal and destroyed them. But the next day, picked up the phone and said, come in, I think I want to commission you. And there are those discussions you can have in the system. So find out who really does hold some budget and some money, have a chat with that person, give them your value proposition, accept it's going to be hard and it will take some time. But at the end of it, you might find there is a commission to be had, which might help you scale in the system at another point. But also be prepared to go through a pilot and think about the fact at the other end you might be exporting somewhere else before you come back into the system. And the final thing that you can't overlook is the fact that a system like the NHS is completely bound by the political cycle. So when that change happens, you can assume there'll be a slowdown for 6 to 9 months before anyone makes a decision. And you have to accept that the cycle you're talking about is probably no less than a year. And obviously, those of you that come from Israel or have got that sort of Israeli perspective or want to get things done right now and be very direct, in a system that might not be as ready as the one that you're coming from, to accept that sort of directness. So to be prepared for that cultural shift.
Thank you. Well, we're quite fortunate that our politics have been very stable and no such interruptions have been happening of late. Moving swiftly on, no politics on this stage tonight. But one of the interesting routes many of the companies in our membership have taken on their kind of journey, if you look towards the end of their journey from startup, has come about largely through a convergence between the pharmaceutical industry, diagnostics companies that wouldn't have classified themselves as digital health companies. But now, as I guess every company has a digital element or is looking to embrace the advantages of digital, they're often the obvious buyers. They can be very acquisitive. So amongst some of our smaller members, we've seen some of the app companies that have a lot of users, they have data, and they have more innovative tools than some of the larger companies, getting snapped up by big pharma, big diagnostics companies. I just wondered if that's something that you've encountered as a global phenomena, and any comments you might have on that convergence and the opportunities that it presents.
So look, I think this is a really exciting time because we're now seeing the convergence between medtech, medicines, and digital health, and it's starting to happen. And it's starting to happen globally, not just in the UK, but everywhere. And I certainly came across good examples of that taking place in Israel and in other parts of the world. I tend to find one of the barriers happens to be the regulatory model, that no one's quite sure where the regulations are going. And certainly in Europe, with the change to the medical device regulation, that in itself is a barrier. Who knows what's going to apply, and how do you regulate something that's in all three camps? Which bit of the regulation applies? So that is a new and emerging challenge. But certainly those smaller companies that some people might think of being more agile tend to come up with those solutions. And of course, the big pharmaceuticals that have a very traditional approach might benefit from those. But really good examples of that have been where you sort of see the blend between the use of AI-type technology for the use in things like diet, combined with those people that might have particular conditions that would benefit from certain types of gene expression, and then against that, monitoring devices. When you bring the three together, you can empower an individual and hand over technology that improves their life without them necessarily seeing a clinician or physician directly.
So I'd actually stretch that convergence a lot further because I see the hop across industry and across sectors absolutely accelerating every single day. I was hearing the other day about some cyber security software that is now being redeployed to work on fraud and analytics. I mean, it is just not going to be an industry where you can say this is health, that is something else. It's all going to blur. Everyone's in the health business, everyone's cares about it, and that the technology and the application of those technologies can jump across. Now, there does need to be people who are expert in that industry to help interpret how that technology should be applied. So it's not about anyone can come along and invent a clinical diagnostic app. You absolutely need healthcare professionals. But those technology jumps, they're happening all the time. And I can see that happening more and more as we stop thinking about things in industry silos. And certainly I would say, if I look at my team, my team now works across financial services, insurance, we're working with comms, media and high tech, as well as, traditional healthcare providers such as the NHS. It's no longer, you can no longer kind of segment along the same line, so we're all going to have to think differently.
I'm thinking, this is the value chain. The value chain will dramatically change in the next 5 to 10 years. It's repeatedly stated that the Google and the Apple and the Amazons, they are buying companies in terms of convergence. They are integrating companies which, I don't know if like a month ago, one would have thought about Fitbit being acquired by this and this. And the boundaries are obviously blurring in terms of wellness and preventions and medical grade. And for instance, we at Sanara Ventures, we invest in medical grade companies, and we do not invest in wellness companies. And sometimes the boundaries are not clear. Nonetheless, those giants, they have a pretty good sense of what their strategy. It's like the Pink Floyd song, Another Brick in the Wall. They're missing some bricks, and they'd like to bring in those bricks. But they have the picture. They have the strategy of seeing whether they're going to provide services, Amazon to 300,000 of their employees, and later on, let it be Walmart, let it be Google and the Apple, and their strengths towards the consumers. This is what I find the most interesting, which I think that companies then again try to represent the companies and maybe hopefully give some, sharpening their strategy, is really, really in terms of, this is my experience and my team, Iran, and the team that Hila, who came along with me, and we've been talking to this guy over there who's not listening now, Itzi, a company of ours named iMedis. I'm just doing a PR for you. So basically, finding the right use case, because eventually if you have multiple applications and you want to be acquired by a company, this is what we are, hopefully looking to have with some of our companies, is really one of the most important steps in terms of that convergence, that ability to be acquired or being integrated to the right application by the providers, by the payers, by the tech giants, is really nailing down the right use case. And alongside of that is the business model, what could be truly monetized. We meet hundreds of those entrepreneurs daily in conferences and the deal flow. Some of those still in Israel, probably elsewhere, they do come with great technologies with lack of understanding of the specific use case, the specific, what should be the low-hanging fruit of that technology. And this is quite tough for them. So in terms of my eyes, in terms of the convergence, and startups then again try to represent those startups' point of view, the true definition of the use case, understand the market before you dive into the technology, before you waste $2 million on developing a technology. And just to illustrate, one of the very first companies that we saw in Sanara when we started 5 years ago came up with the kind of hypoglycemia, like for kids when they wake up at night, or for the parents actually that need to check their kids in order to avoid hypoglycemia. They sometimes wake up 3 or 4 times during the night just to measure the kids, making sure that they will not fall into hypoglycemia. We had met a company that really had an interesting technology, but they wasted like 1.5 years and their own, whatever, $1 million or $1.5 million on building the hardware. Now, happen to be that there are a few little guys that are doing the hardware regardless with the watches, right? What's the point of building up the hardware? You should focus on the black box, on the know-how, on your specific value creation when you come up to this, and let it be the pattern of sweating that they had and whatever that might indicate the hypoglycemia. They came to us and said, we don't have any money, we don't. So it's not just the use case, it's the use of your technology to the right use case and your value proposition, as Sam mentioned before. And this is something that has to be understood. When you talk as investors, when you meet those startup companies, please, tell them straight in their face, like we do sometimes, that this is a no-go in so many cases.
Thanks, Assaf. I guess that example of nighttime hypoglycemia is a good segue into our next question, which is really around the notion that healthcare is something that happens in a doctor's surgery or in a hospital is one that's being dispelled, and one that I think we all know, not only do we need to move away from, but it's preferable to move away from. Who wants to be in a hospital unless you need to be? So as technological improvements mean that you can do remote monitoring, remote diagnosis, and sometimes even remote treatment, without people having to leave the comfort of their own homes. I guess the propensity to benefit both patients and the system has increased hugely. It's something that we've heard from Israeli companies and from the people here is much more advanced, and Israel as a system has been much better set up to do that than we have perhaps here in the UK. Is that your experience, and do you think there's therefore a lot of potential in the UK for those companies?
In terms of validation, you said in hospitals?
In terms of the widespread use of that technology, so keeping people out of hospitals, remote monitoring, telemedicine, telecare, all of the various things that we could do that don't necessarily involve travel to a hospital as the traditional mainstream form of delivering healthcare.
Yeah, I think that Israel does stand with tons of technologies that represent that. I just saw a colleague and a friend of mine from VR Health who's doing remote rehabilitation. I think Iran was here, if I'm not mistaken. Another company of ours, of Sanara, is My Home Doc, a device that is based on the smartphone that can do primary care remotely from the patient's home. We know TechUK, we know Healthy.io that has been commercialized now in Boots and for the urine test. This is a trend, and this is a train that have left the station. There's no doubt that in the next 10 years, the more will be much more services that will be provided at home. We have some initiatives in Israel with some group and senior physicians who are setting up JVs in order to address that and build services in patients' home. It's a must do. If you look into the GDP of some countries, I mean, we cannot stand it for too long. And we do have those capacities, let it be then again for remote rehabilitation, let it be for remote primary care, or simply the post-discharge, the follow-up post-discharge with some of the companies that are doing monitoring at home. And then again, going back to your previous question, we see the guys that, for instance, we work with, Philips. Philips is into the continuum, the cycle of us as people, the continuum of care prior to hospitalization with wellness and prevention, and in the hospital with obviously the CT scans and other imaging or monitoring technologies, and then post-hospitalization, the ability to provide the support is needed post-hospitalization. So we as Sanara, we invest in those companies on behalf of Philips, trying to bring some value to them and hopefully see more of those. So we've been seeing dozens and dozens of companies in Israel. And I think the fact that the system has been built, we have, in some cases, I came back from Japan, and in some other cases, you don't need to go as far. But lacking the HMOs in between the patient's home, and you have only the hospitals. And what's in between? There's nothing. There's a gap. There's a big black hole, which is God forbid, because I mean, we have in Israel for so many years 4 HMOs, and the community services are being provided like we take it for granted. And it makes sense. There's no need to rush to the hospital on every headache. There are some systems, obviously, which are not like that, and as such, we fail to understand. I'm not saying that this is the best model. Maybe there would be more shifting towards from the community care into home care, and with that, we are good to go. But there's got to be something that bridges the gaps. And in Israel, at least, it seems that we're making a good job in that.
I think this comes down to what sort of problem we want to solve. What are the access and availability issues in a particular place? Because mHealth, eHealth, T-Health, remote health, it's all pretty much blurring into one. And it means there are a lot of different terms within that, but effectively these things are beginning to come together. And ultimately, you probably want something like Mercy Hospital in the US, which is a hospital which is completely virtual. There are no patients in their hospital. There are some clinicians there, but they're dealing with all those patients virtually. That's a good example of one extreme. But their access and availability problem is very perhaps different to the one that we might have here in the UK, and probably quite different to the one that you'd have maybe in Israel. And that might be one of the drivers, that might be the delta that people need in order to determine are they going towards the e-health model or not. The regulatory model will be quite different in those environments, which means the rate of adoption will be different. And then there's digital penetration. If you take somewhere like London, we have, 94% digital penetration. People are very digital and used to using technology. You go to somewhere like Birmingham, it's a lot lower. Whereas if I take places like Israel, it's quite variable across the country. And that's probably another driver around whether or not people use that type of technology in order to manage their health. And then it comes down to cultural things. Take places like Argentina, where actually they don't have that bad connectivity, But culturally, people still want to face-to-face eyeball a clinician, irrespective of all the technology available. So sometimes the environment is something we have to really consider before these things are ready and can be adopted. But certainly I think there's appetite, and I would certainly be looking at what's the infrastructure like, does the data layer connect, what's the digital penetration like in the population, and how ready are the clinicians themselves to allow the acceptance of the technology. And then fundamentally, what's the access problem? Do you have an access problem or not in that environment? So here in the UK, you could argue we do have an access problem, but on the other side, we don't. We have a hospital in London every 2.3 miles. So we have a very different set of issues to those that may require lots of travel and crossing difficult borders.
So the only thing I'll add to what's been said, because I think it's all very valid, is there is a real, with all of this, that there are two things that really challenge the NHS, and the main one is scale, right? So just to give you, a really banal example, right? We run the email system for the NHS, right? We hit problems that Microsoft themselves had never hit. That's the scale. Nobody had ever implemented 1.4 million mailboxes in a single system. So don't underestimate the difficulty of scale. It's easier to scale in a smaller country, in a network of hospitals. People often come and talk to us about the Norway example, which is great, and they've got a population health record and great learnings. It's the size of one of the regions in the UK. So the scale of the NHS is quite big, and so if you are trying to get something, as Sam was saying, that's going to scale across the whole of the NHS, and you're a startup, just be prepared that that's a big thing to scale, right? So remember that solving a problem on one level is not necessarily the same as solving it on a massive level. The other thing is about the people change. So there are lots and lots and lots of companies out there who have phenomenal technology that is really incredible and is going to solve. I'm convinced there's several startups I meet, and I'm convinced they're going to solve. I want to be people who go, I saw them first, right? Because I'm convinced in years to come we'll go, that was a game changer. But the human element, the clinicians and the patient, the person, the citizen, we need to be taken on that journey. Right? We weren't all born knowing how to use an iPad. We are now conditioned massively to use it. That's great, and now you can leverage on that, but just remember when you're introducing all that new technology, there is such a big human element, and we've got to get that right if you want to be able to get that rolled out and scaled.
I think on that human element, ultimately we're all here to benefit the health of the populations of whatever geography we're operating in. Is there, in terms of the Israeli example and the UK, there are obvious differences in scale, but I suppose there's an extent to which you divide up the geography of your country however you see fit and create the optimum scale on which to organise yourselves. Now, the future reorganisation of the NHS is something that's coming, and I'm sure we all look forward to that with glee. But in terms of the actual populations, do you think from experience in the two geographies, are there different attitudes amongst the population in their susceptibility to, I was thinking, it's not just a kind of willingness to use technology, but we've seen a lot of problems here in terms of consent. So consent to use data outside of direct care, particularly when there's sometimes it can be an unhealthy suspicion towards the health tech sector. I wondered if that is the case in Israel, or if there are different views.
Generally speaking, there's a true will to test and try by the population, by the citizens, by the patients, by the consumers. Let it be wellness by the consumers, or let it be. Nonetheless, in my eyes, it falls, and this could be the similarities, maybe then again with the NHS or here in the UK. I think that, for instance, when a hospital or when an HMO is launching a new product or a new service, it has to go through the process, the routine process of awareness and campaigns, but there's always something that falls apart in the adaptation, and this is one side you don't match it to the population, to the age, to the certain age. You do a wide campaign of new services, but those technologies can truly come at the back scene and help, either segment the market or run the campaign in much effective way. And I'm aiming towards an example, a very simple example. The second largest HMO in Israel is called Maccabi Sikfan, and they came up with a technology by a company called Medial Early Sign of colorectal cancer, whereby, and I'm going to speak about it in my presentation tomorrow as well, but it's a good example, I think. Basically, a lady that was here, named Professor Varda Shalev, who is heading the research for the Maccabi Sikfan with 2 million patients, lost a patient. He died from cancer, and this is a known story she's been telling in so many conferences. And she was quite depressed after she said, how come did I miss him? How come I did not see anything when he got cancer and I was here with him, but nothing was detected? Eventually, when she looked into his blood test, on a year by year, his hemoglobin levels were normal. In those ballpark numbers, it was quite okay. In the green lines, I don't know, we have those green lines, 2 green lines. It was within a good fit within the green lines on a year by year. But 5 years down the road, when the trend was noted, actually there was a deep decline in the hemoglobin level, and that should have been an indicator that something bad is happening with this specific patient. Now they came up, Maccabi, to Medial Early Sign, this startup company, and they developed an algorithm which basically raised a flag. I mean, on one side, we all see colonoscopy, but 10%, at least in Israel, the numbers are 10%. 10% of the people who were exposed to those campaigns eventually do go through the colonoscopy. And all the others may have been seen, forgotten, whatever, who knows. Now this technology came in, and this is exactly what I was referring to, with the ability for those who have this decline and deviation from the normal, which not could be seen initially, but with the big data of accumulating data of 5 years, you can now see the trend. Now Maccabi Sikfan is doing that behind the scene, and whoever is being detected with the decline, he's been called upon proactively by the Sikfan, come and do a colonoscopy. So this is the integration of both campaigns on one side, and then the willingness of patients to do or not to do, but nonetheless the beauty in those technologies that they can truly segment and profile the specific risk groups and really target them for whatever campaign and for whatever hopefully preventive steps that could save so much lives and money.
I mean, look, I think that's a great example of where data coming together makes a massive difference. But part of that comes from the attitude in that people have got this willingness that they want to get things done, and they recognize the benefit in sharing their data to achieve that outcome.
If you know that you're in danger, you would go. If you know that you're in danger now, this is the second level of information and data, then you would go. By just having a journal campaign of colonoscopy, not too many people will eventually go. But if they explain it to you, this is crossing the bridge of really making people reacting and going to do that.
And I think that's really important, that culturally there's an attitude that has changed. People are now doing it, that drive has now happened. Whereas I think in a system here, certainly in the UK, if it's a comparison, there's probably a slightly different approach in that people are used to the system perhaps working in a certain way and operating in a certain way, which means culturally people aren't necessarily ready to share that data or necessarily take ownership of the data to have that type of insight that might come from it. And I think there's probably different attitudes to data sharing, the fluidity of that data, and what it might mean in terms of the insight and the analysis that gets to that endpoint. And that's the problem. We're not necessarily sharing outputs that reach that insight. And if we get that cultural shift, we might have a difference here as well.
All I would add to that is we do quite regular surveys on consumer attitudes to health. And, one of the things that kind of frustrates me is actually the UK has really positive attitudes. So actually, if you go and survey individuals in the UK, they're really quite open. On average, it's an average, of course, but more so than other countries. And then what is most frustrating is we're actually doing a poor job of delivering against their expectations as consumers. And I know we are gripped in health. I haven't worked in health all my life. I'm a relative newcomer, but we are gripped in this industry by the sins of the past, which were great and weighty. But, I think, for example, some of the reluctance around data usage and sharing in health was a lack of a good conversation that was had at that time about, care.data or whatever, but we don't have good conversations. And actually, we need to learn how to have better conversations with citizens about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're using their data. And we need to be just more grown up and have realer conversations, some of which is going to be, I think, for example, sorry, you don't get to opt out of a free healthcare system. You have got to give some level of data back. That's the quid pro quo. You don't have to give all of it, but we should go and say, well, hang on, if it's free to you to be looked after, then you should give some of that data. Now, that may or may not happen. I just think we need to have harder, more real, bolder conversations with people, and I think they're ready.
So a new social contract with the NHS specific to data could happen. We're out of time. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm conscious I'm standing between a lot of people and the bar, so I'll keep my points very brief, but just to say there are some great tips from both within the NHS and from companies who've been working both with the NHS here in Israel and with companies, with health systems internationally. I really like the phrase heaven for health tech. I thought it was in Leeds, but apparently it's in Israel, so I'll have to go there very soon. But other than that, all that's left to me is to thank our panel for giving up their time this evening. So if you could give a round of applause for Niamh, Assaf and Sam. Thank you.